An unprecedented wave of anti-government protests in Lebanon demanding the ouster of all political leaders has forced the resignation of the Prime Minister. But what is next for a country on the brink of economic collapse? Hello and welcome to Bigger Than Five with me, Rida Fakhri. The resignation of Lebanon's Prime Minister, Saad Hariri, after 2 weeks of anti-government protests, has left the country at a critical juncture. Hundreds of thousands of Lebanese citizens from all walks of life joined the country's biggest protest movement yet, accusing the country's political elite of rampant corruption and economic mismanagement. The protests, which were initially sparked by a proposed tax on mobile messaging apps like WhatsApp, quickly morphed into a nationwide grassroots movement aiming to drive out the country's ruling class, which has remained virtually unchanged for much of the last 3 decades. The government initially responded to the protests by announcing a package of reforms that included cutting the salaries of current and former politicians by half, establishing an anti-corruption committee, increasing taxes on bank profits, and assistance for poor families. But that offer was rejected by the protesters, who pledged not to stop until the entire government resigns. In a few moments, we'll be speaking with Ziad Baroud, who previously served as the country's Minister of Interior and Municipalities, about the implications of the Prime Minister's resignation and what comes next. But first, the voice of 2 protesters on why they decided to join the movement.
وصلت العالم لمطرح اختنقت من وراء الضرائب والسرقة وعالم عم تدفع اشياء ما عم تعرف لوين عم بتروح. بتعرف اكيد قد ايه الدخل لكل افراد الطبقة العادية. الحد الادنى من $600 ل $700 ل $1000. طب هيدا اللي مجوز واللي عنده مدارس وعندك اكل وكله غالي بلبنان وعندك تليفون اكيد وعندك اجار البيت حاليا بلبنان بيتراوح من $300 $350 وانت وطالع. طب هيدا شو بيبقى من معاش وكيف بيعيش؟ ما سألتوا عن العالم؟ ليه في اولاد بدها تموت من الجوع؟ وليه اولادكم يعني عم بتبهور مصاري وبيتعلموا برا؟ نحن بنتعلم هون وعم نناطح بعضنا نتعلم وما بنلاقي وظائف. ليه؟ بدهم يلغوا الوراثة بلبنان. هيدي الوراثة، انا اذا بيي وزير بصير وزير، اذا بيي رئيس بصير رئيس. شو فيهم من 40 سنة، بديش اقول من 30، من 40 سنة لهلا ما حدا منهم تغير، بعضهم نفس العيال اللي حاكمة. لما انت حدا بالدولة او بالنظام بيعمل عرس ب$8 مليون، قد ايه معه يعني؟ منين هيدا؟ من معاش؟ اكيد لا، اكيد هيدا من لعب بالدولار ولعب باموال الناس وسرقة.
الحريري حرامي حرامي حرامي. أنا قبل بشتغل بوزارة الشؤون، نحن أجراء بمشروع لأسر أكثر فقراً المحرومين. نحن صرنا 7 أشهر مش قابضين وعم باكل واشرب، بس أنا بقول لك ماما وصلت لمرحلة ما معي حق ربطة خبز. عم بحضر على التلفزيون قامت الثورة ببيروت ولقيت شاب عمره 24 سنة صار يبكي يقول أنا ما معي آكل، أنا مخلص جامعة، ماني تعلمت، بدي سافر ما بدي سافر، هالبلد لإلي. ليه شعوريا؟ لبست ثيابي سولفاتمون وبمشيتي ونزلت على الشارع. رنيت قالوا لرفقاتي نزلنا، كلنا 1 صرنا 10 صرنا 100 وما حنطلع من الشارع لنسترد حقوقنا. مالنا المنهوب نازلين فينا ضرايب، مش واتساب اللي نزلنا على الشارع. نحن اختنقنا ضرايب ضرايب ضرايب، كهرباء، اشتراك، لك زباله، طفنا، سرطان ومعنا اولادنا ما معنا نحكمها. شوف الاولاد المريضه بالشارع، لك اذا حرق مستشفى السلام بتشوف امراض السرطان بدنا ندفع حق الدواء تبعنا. هلا وزير الصحه بيقول لي ضمان شيخوخه ما في، لك ضمان اجتماعي ما في. الشعب عم يشحد. جوعونا طبقه طرابلسيه، الشعب بالشمال ما في شيء اسمه غني، كلنا صرنا فقراء. الفقير صار تحت الارض. يتركوا لنا لبنان وحياه شرف. اكبر واحد بطرابلس الفقير بيوصل على الكرسي انجح منهم كلياتهم. وهذا اللي نحن بدنا اياه. انتفاضتنا مستمره لنستلم الدوله، نحن ما بدنا اياهم.
So that is the way Ali and Linda see the situation. For more now on the way forward, I'm joined by Ziad Baroud, an independent civil servant who served as Lebanon's Minister of Interior and Municipalities between 2008 and 2011. Dr. Baroud, what does Hariri's resignation mean for Lebanon moving forward? Will it satisfy the protesters who've been demanding real and fundamental systemic change, not just window dressing?
It's a first step. It's one of the main demands of protesters. It means that we're on track. It means that after 12, 13 days of uprising, things are moving in a different direction, which is globally good, provided we put things on track properly.
But are things on track? I mean, it did take a while for the Prime Minister to resign, and some have seen it happen before, whether willingly or under duress. He's resigned before. Is this different? Is this more permanent?
This is different because it's the result of a peaceful uprising where people took the streets and said that they are fed up, so to speak, and that they need change in government. They need change not only in the cabinet itself, but in the way politicians are dealing with public issues.
And people are also fed up with the fact that some of these politicians are manipulated from abroad by regional or international powers. Are you beginning to see a shift in the balance of power, an end of this decades-old sectarianism in Lebanon?
Things are not the way they used to be, and there's a change in the mood of the people, and actually one can witness to what extent people's voice is being louder, and people's demand are way beyond the traditional polarization.
But beyond the symbolism, can Lebanon truly move beyond this sectarianism, beyond the political quota system that is reserved for traditional warlords of the past 30 years or so?
It will be up to the people of Lebanon, to the Lebanese people, to be serious about this. And the human chain that started yesterday or the day before is symbolic, yes, but it reflects actually what people feel and what people want. I think it's only the beginning of something that should continue.
And one of the things that people want is that they want a new technocratic government made of people like you, independent, non-affiliated to any political parties. But do you see that happening at all? Would you be willing to join, even lead a movement like this? And do you think the traditional ruling elite would allow people like you to lead such a movement?
Well, first, it's not about me or anybody else. It's not personal. It's about the country. Second, the elite you're mentioning is today not really free of making choices the way it used to do. Things are different. When people took the streets, they imposed a new agenda. They imposed a new way of dealing with choices. And I would say that this is the first time maybe in the modern history of Lebanon where things are evolving in the good direction.
If people do want to see a new technocratic government with a political system that is so deeply flawed, built on decades of sectarianism and allegiances to foreign forces, can that really happen? Who will appoint these technocrats?
It's beyond this traditional decision-making process. Today, the streets are following very closely any decision that would be taken even by the traditional political class. It's about people this time. It's really different.
It's about people, but can this movement remain faceless? Can it remain leaderless for very much longer?
Not necessarily, but until now, it was good to avoid having to personify the leadership.
And yet some within the political establishment, certainly the leader of Hezbollah, Hassan Nasrallah, has warned that this movement could actually be exploited by outside forces, that if the government did resign, which it now has, it could create a vacuum. Do you share his concerns?
It would be deadly for the movement to fall under any any hidden agenda. I think that the peoples on the streets are very keen on avoiding any rattachement to any international or foreign power whatsoever. It should remain purely Lebanese. It should remain the people's voice.
But is it purely Lebanese? There are those who believe that it is being funded and guided by hidden hands, hidden forces outside of Lebanon. Do you see it as a truly spontaneous movement?
It started this way, and it should continue this way. And I trust that many Lebanese are fed up, and they absolutely took the streets because they wanted their children to live in a better place. So yes, it was spontaneous, and it was coming from anger and suffocation.
Anger and suffocation, people, as you say, fed up with the years of government inefficiency, poor governance, theft, cronyism, the injustices that have been created around them. They want accountability, though. Who is going to hold any of these politicians who have not just become millionaires but also billionaires in some cases? Who will hold them accountable when the justice system itself, many people consider, is deeply corrupt?
Well, I think that we have excellent judges. Yes, the judiciary has a role to play in this, a major role. At some point, the judiciary was appointed and is still appointed by the political class that is ruling the country, but it doesn't mean that we cannot rely on the judiciary in the coming weeks, months, and years.
But does this mean that you think that these accusations that many of the politicians have faced for embezzling public funds should be pursued in a court of law? I mean, should there be trials, and should some of this money be returned?
Definitely. There should be investigation to start with, and the investigation could lead to court hearings, and people and those who are responsible for wrongdoings should be taken to trial.
But let's face it, is that something that is likely to happen?
Yes, it happened in other countries. Those who were responsible for embezzlement were taken to court. This is doable, provided we have a clean investigation, we have trustworthy judges who could take the lead in the investigation, and Lebanese people are really expecting results.
And meanwhile, the governor of the Central Bank of Lebanon, Riyad Salameh, has been warning that the country's economy could collapse within days if these protests continue. The banks have been closed for many days now. Is that a real prospect, do you think? Or is this just fear-mongering to get the people off the streets?
It's true, because we've been, for a couple of years now, not taking any serious measures in order to avoid the crisis and to avoid the collapse.
And just finally, one of the key demands is obviously more representation, more democracy. Can you see the day anytime soon where the Lebanese can truly aspire to becoming a democracy, one man, one vote? Or is that pure fantasy, given the very real local and regional dynamics?
What I can say is that a good representation needs parliamentary elections, a good electoral law. The demands of the streets are partly to have early general elections. The change in the mood of the streets could justify the call for early or earlier general elections. This has to do with the new law. This has to do with the new cabinet, and it's definitely something we need to contemplate once we have a new cabinet formed.
Dr. Ziad Baroud, thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you.
The recent wave of protests in Lebanon is the largest the country has ever seen, with an estimated 2 million people out on the streets. A new proposed tax bill may have been the trigger, but the roots of Lebanon's troubles go much deeper than that. Aus Haidari has our 5 facts.
Lebanon is one of the most indebted countries in the world, with government debt estimated at 155% of the GDP. Inflation has also been steadily rising over the years, reaching 6% in 2018, and fiscal deficit has reached 11% of the GDP in the same year. In 2014, Lebanon's top 10% income earners made up 57% of the total income earned, while the bottom 50% of earners accounted for just 11%. The Lebanese economy relies heavily on remittances and bank deposits from wealthy locals. About 1% of all accounts are estimated to hold roughly half of the country's total deposits. Lebanon has not been able to supply 24-hour electricity since the 1975 civil war. The government has also been unable to resolve their waste management crisis. Their solution was to dump garbage across the mountains and shorelines, which resulted in a water pollution problem. The government has also failed to create jobs for youth whose unemployment rate is at 37%. Lebanon operates under a system of religious pluralism called confessionalism, where political power is distributed along religious lines. The president must always be a Maronite Christian, the prime minister a Sunni Muslim, and the Speaker of Parliament a Shia Muslim. Their system has at times resulted in political stagnation. Between 2014 and 2016, Lebanon was without a president, and it took Parliament 46 attempts to successfully elect one. Meddling in Lebanon's politics is not new. The country, which was under French mandate until 1946, had 15,000 U.S. Marines land on their shores in 1958 to counter Arab nationalists trying to form the United Arab Republic. Less than 20 years later, at the request of the Lebanese government, Syria sent troops into Lebanon during the civil war and ended up maintaining control over much of the country's affairs until 2005. Finally, Lebanon has long been at the center of battle of influence between Iran and Saudi Arabia.
So then how will these protests change the balance of power? I'm joined from Beirut by Mona Fakaz, Professor of Urban Planning at the American University of Beirut and a member of the grassroots political movement Beirut Medinati. And with me here in Washington, Paul Salem, President of the Middle East Institute. Professor Fakaz, you've been demonstrating for days, encouraging people to stay on the streets to maintain the public pressure on the government. Yeah. The Prime Minister has now resigned. Where do we go from here?
Okay, so really the ball right now is in the hands of the president, who has to appoint a cabinet. The demands of almost everyone I've spoke to on the street are the same. We need an independent, small, competent government that can walk us through the crisis and through the political transition. I think this is a very clear demand. This is where people are meeting on it, with a very strong emphasis really from way more people than you can imagine, that what we need to walk out of is the sectarian division and organization of our government that needs to be rethought of if we want to set the country in the right course.
Paul Salem, can years of sectarianism be undone in just 2 weeks of protests?
Well, obviously, I don't think anybody expects that to be undone so quickly, but what has happened in 2 weeks is really a historic uprising. We had maybe something of a similar scope in 2005, but it was about something completely different, which was about the Syrian presence and the assassination of Prime Minister Hariri. This type of movement maybe started in 2015 with the You Stink movement and the beginning to focus on the corruption of the political class. And it got worse in the recent year after the election of a new president and then appointment of a new cabinet under Prime Minister Hariri. They dealt with the international community and got promises for economic help, but they failed to do any of the reforms or make any progress on governance or reform in order to save the country. And this was made all the more worse by the recent forest fires and revelations of massive corruption by many people at the top.
Corruption, poor governance, decades of rule by the political elites, Mona Fakaz. 2 million people on the streets, women at the forefront, people from every segment of society as well. Absolutely. Under one banner, one flag. But who is leading this movement? Because as you're well aware, many people are cynical, saying that it is being exploited by outside forces.
So they went on the street in a very individual form. It was very spontaneous, but then I think it began to turn into something much more interesting when for the first time we saw that the protests were not just in Beirut, they were everywhere in Lebanon. And they were not by one sect or they were not guided by anyone. So any talk of leadership that is over and over emphasized right now, like they need to have a representative, really reflects a poor understanding of the ground and of the context of this movement.
But what about the regional powers, though? What about the hidden hands that so many people are used to looking at, whether it's the United States, France, or the regional powers, Saudi Arabia and Iran? They all have a horse in this race, don't they?
Anytime you're going to see 2 million on the street, everyone's going to try to do something. But what I want to emphasize over and over again is the thrust of this movement is a local force. It's a very indigenous movement. It's a very organic growth. You can see it if you're spending time on the street. You can see the kind of conversations that exist. And let's not forget that these are not only people who are getting poorer and poorer, but they're people who are poorer and poorer watching $3 million weddings, $15 million weddings, really very lavish displays of wealth by public sector servants who should not be making the kind of money they obviously are displaying.
As you say, I mean, you refer to a lot of corruption facts that are very important and that have mobilized this amount of people onto the streets. Paul Salim, you were there at the beginning of these protests. Private wealth in Lebanon over the last 5 years alone has gone from 91 billion to 232 billion, while the national average income has decreased by 8%. People are clearly fed up. But can there be accountability?
Well, it's a combination of corruption and also poor governance. They're different issues. The poor governance has led to an economy that is now stagnant and might be shrinking, a terrible mismanagement of public debt, such that most of whatever revenue is collected goes to servicing a public debt. An economy which should be booming, which should be creating jobs for its young people, ends up exporting its young people rather than providing jobs for them. Now, when we look at the short term and the medium term, in the short term, the immediate demand, as Dr. Fawaz mentioned, is the immediate formation of a credible, independent, nonpartisan, clean, capable, and small cabinet that can move quickly to address some of the immediate economic confidence issues which threaten to take the Lebanese pound to unprecedented levels, might cause a run on the banks. In the long term, I want to mention, the challenge for the population and the protesters is to how to turn this amazing moment of national unity and national mobilization into a movement that can win elections. At the end of the day, what's tragic is that most of these people are elected and re-elected. That's the key that we have to change.
Mona Fawaz, your thoughts on that? The Prime Minister himself has resigned several times over the last few years. How worried are you that the same old players will be going in and out of office and nothing much will be changing in the long term?
All I can say is that what I'm hearing from people on the street, in the teach-ins we're organizing, in the open mic debates we're doing, in the op-eds and the tweets, is that there's a lot of determination to stay on the street for however long it takes so that we make sure that our voices are heard. I'm definitely cautiously optimistic because the points that Dr. Salim is pointing are all correct. And if we get to the point where the financial crisis is not addressed, we may be in very horrific scenarios.
But what do you say to those, though? What do you say to those who warn of a political vacuum and an imminent financial collapse if the protests continue?
Well, to begin with, the financial collapse started before the protest. The protest started because of the financial collapse. We should remember the banks were already not giving out dollars. We should remember that we were already standing in line at gas stations and in bakeries before the protest started. So the point is not, the point is, how do we address the crisis? Are we going to impose more taxes on low-income people so that we finance the government debt when most of this debt is from the bankers who have made unprecedented profits in the last 10 years? Or are we going to get a government that realizes that them and the banks need to pitch in and start an immediate process of financial stabilization and building an economy?
Paul Salim, Lebanon's problem is very complicated, with so many different competing regional and international powers having something at stake in how the country moves forward. We saw how the uprisings in the region have ended, whether it's in Syria, in Iraq, in Libya, in Sudan, in Algeria, and the list goes on. How will this be different, and how invested is the United States and other big powers? In which direction will they be pushing?
Well, as Dr. Fawaz said, this is almost completely a domestic development. Of course, there are players, there's Hezbollah there, so that draws attention from other countries as well. But It really is a domestic phenomenon, largely about domestic governance, which I might say is what most of the Arab Spring revolutions were about as well. Lebanon as a society and a political system is very different than Egypt, very different than Iraq. Every country has its own course.
But is it aimed at any specific regional power, at any specific
Not
party?
at all, no. It's aimed at changing the corrupt Lebanese oligarchy, which has been ruling and misruling and skimming off what little wealth there is for itself, and driving the country towards a division, a sectarian division, and impoverishment. That's what the revolution is trying to change.
Paul Salem and Mona Fawaz, thank you both very much for being part of this important discussion.
Thank you.
And so Lebanon once again teeters between hope and collapse. And what happens there is bound to have far-reaching geostrategic repercussions in a region rife with war and conflict. What makes this latest popular uprising historic for Lebanese politics is that for once and for now, the flags of political parties that reflect the deeply entrenched sectarian system are out of sight. It remains to be seen if they can be buried for good and if a non-sectarian democratic system will emerge. A system capable of addressing people's genuine socio-economic grievances and getting rid of a fundamentally corrupt and unaccountable political class. From me, Rida Fakhri, and all the team here in Washington, thanks for watching. We'll see you next time.